Welcome to my lecture on Immanuel Kant, considered a German philosopher, though he lived in Königsberg. And Königsberg is in a place called Kaliningrad now in Russia. So he's the last of the major Enlightenment thinkers, last major philosopher of the Enlightenment period, and along with Aristotle and perhaps Mill, considered one of the heavyweights of ethics. So he's very popular as a professor, very sociable, although he had a very awkward disposition. He took daily walks, supposedly, and the story is that the townspeople of Königsberg could set their watches to his daily walks. He was just, had a very strict regimen. And we'll see, his ethics is quite austere, to say the least. Kant's moral philosophy is often referred to as deontological ethics, or sometimes simply Kantian ethics. And it's a sharp contrast to consequentialism and utilitarianism, which is what we'll cover next with Mill. And it also is quite distinct from Aristotle and Aquinas. Kant rejects the idea that rightness and wrongness of our moral actions depends on the outcome of these actions. Such reasonings, he claimed, are a posteriori in nature. When searching for ethical principles, Kant thinks it's necessary that the principles have to be a priori in nature. That is, they should be valid regardless of a particular consequence that they might entail. So a priori versus a posteriori. The Latin phrase a priori, prior to, a posteriori, after the fact, after. So for Kant, he wants his moral judgment to be possible before we know the outcome, and regardless of the situation. Necessary regardless of context. So to the reading here from the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals. The first question that Kant starts off asking at the beginning of the first section is, what in the world is there that's regarded good without qualification? Similar question to the one Aristotle asks at the beginning of the reading we did for Aristotle. What is the highest good? What is the highest aim for man? It has to be something we want for the sake of itself, not for the sake of anything else. Of course, Aristotle says that's happiness. But Kant he's not looking for some external good. What he wants is something within a moral character that is considered good without qualifications. So qualities such as intelligence, wit, judgment, courage, resoluteness, perseverance, power, riches, honors, all of these that he mentions, he believes these are potentially good, but also potentially harmful when they're misused. So the thing that he believes that's good without qualification is what he calls a good will. He thinks that a good will is necessary to correct oneself or to guard oneself against the misuse of other qualities, the ones just mentioned, intelligence, wit. In order for these not to be misused, we have to have a good will that guides us. So someone who doesn't harbor a good will, yet enjoys uninterrupted prosperity, can never, as Kant puts it, can never delight a rational, impartial spectator. We could never watch somebody succeed in life and dupe everybody and really succeed and get everything they want, and then at the same time, as a rational spectator, applaud that or say that that's morally worthy. So a good will, he thinks, is necessary for one to even be worthy of happiness. Right? So that's a problem with Aristotle. He thinks the aim is happiness. But for Kant, you have to be first worthy of it. A good will is not good because of the ability to attain some end. That's not the goal, right? It's not trying to get at some aim or telos, as Aristotle would say, or Aquinas. So that's not what makes a good will good, not by what it brings about. For Kant, a good will is only good through its willing. In other words, it is good in itself. And he thinks it's the only thing like this, so it should be held in the highest esteem. And even if somebody was completely incompetent, somebody regularly missed the mark, as Aristotle might say, he thinks even if somebody wrought complete havoc on everything they touched, even then they are to be held in the highest esteem so long as their intentions are good. So the goodwill is good based on the intentions of the action, not the outcome, right? As long as you possess a good will, for Kant, this has full value in itself. And when we get to John Stuart Mill, we'll see that he certainly wouldn't like this. But how does this work? Why should we value this goodwill? Why is it good in itself? It seems a strange idea that one should ignore outcomes and consequences. Now Kant turns to what he calls a naturalistic account of ethics, and I believe he has Aquinas, Aristotle in mind here, perhaps even David Hume, but we're not really covering him, so I'll forgo an explanation of Hume. But the idea is that nature furnishes us with organs that are appropriate to serve a certain function. We have hands to grasp, eyes to see, organs which circulate and process fluids and nutrients. And if nature furnished us with reason and a will, and the function of this is to seek happiness, a la Aristotle and Aquinas, then Kant says she has furnished us, nature has furnished us, with a very inappropriate tool. So the claim that Aristotle makes and Aquinas certainly makes, that we use reason and rationality to achieve the aim of happiness, seems misguided to Kant. He thinks if that's the case, then nature's played a cruel joke on us. Reason doesn't seem to be the best tool to use in order to seek happiness. He thinks to seek happiness, perhaps our instincts would be more appropriate. Why complicate things with reason? Oftentimes, he says the use of reason pushes us further away from happiness. It makes it easier for us to discern a lack or an imperfection, something short of absolute happiness. And sometimes the rational people come to envy the more common run of men. This reminds me of something that Mill says about Socrates dissatisfied, that we'll get to in the lecture on utilitarianism. Existence, Kant thinks, has another much more worthy purpose than simply pursuing happiness. He says that reason has a practical faculty, as opposed to a speculative or theoretical faculty. He says that reason can be used to guide our will. That's what he means by practical use of reason. Reason guiding our will. Its true purpose, in this practical sense, must be to produce a will which is not merely good as a means to an end, not this teleological conception that we get with Aristotle, but rather reason should be there to produce a will that is good in itself, that is an end in itself. And such a will, maybe not the sole good or the complete good, Kant acknowledges this, but he says it's the condition for all good. Anything else, intelligence, wit, these are destroyed if they don't come from the good will, if they don't issue forth from a good will. So the end of reason, its function, its goal, not happiness for Kant, it's to achieve the good will. This is a prerequisite, he says, for all goodness. So reason may even restrict happiness. It's always conditioned by empirical conditions, empirical or contextual conditions. Happiness depends on the outcomes, depends on what works, depends on other people. Kant doesn't want his ethical judgments to be so uncertain as to depend on these uncertain empirical things. He wants it to be a priori again and apply to all conditions at all times. So fulfilling the purpose of reason may interfere with the purposes of our inclination, which is going to be subjective and based on the circumstances. So to elucidate, to further explain this concept of a good will, the will that is good in itself regardless of the ends or the consequences it brings about, Kant turns to the concept of duty. So duty is something that helps to explain the goodwill. If the goodwill is not acting according to its needs, its inclinations, its desires, well, what is it acting according to? Well, it's acting according to its duty. Duty itself, for that to make sense, for duty to make sense, a goodwill is necessary. The goodwill always acts from a sense of duty. But Kant admits that this is a hard thing to do, to act purely from these motives and no other motives besides the motive of acting according to duty. He mentions what he calls subjective restrictions and hindrances to our acting according to duty. In case one, he mentions when our actions are contrary to duty, even though they're useful for certain ends. I might lie, which is against my duty. I should never lie, according to Kant, but it might be useful for me to lie. So though that would be one subjective hindrance. The second example he mentions is when our actions are in accordance with duty. I may have done what I'm supposed to do, but I did it for another reason. I did it due to some other inclination of mine, not because it was my duty. The third case sounds a lot like the second. He says actions are in accordance with duty. That is, I am performing my duty, but from my own personal subjective standpoint, I'm doing it from an immediate selfish purpose. I have this immediate selfish purpose to perform it. And last but not least, he has a special case where we try to save our lives, to preserve one's life. He thinks that's a subjective hindrance. Kant believes we should try to save our own lives. We have a duty to ourselves to protect ourselves, but oftentimes, most of the time, he thinks, we don't do this out of a sense of duty. We are just doing it because of our own needs, our inclinations, and our desires. When we see a train coming towards us, we jump out of the way as almost an instinctual reaction. We don't look at the train and then reason, well, geez, a train is coming to me. As a rational being, I have a duty to myself to protect myself, so I better step out of the way so the train doesn't kill me. This is not what's going on in our head in those situations. We simply jump out of the way because we don't want to die. So this is, I think, what Kant is trying to point out in case 4, that yes, of course, it is a good thing to save your life, but often we don't do it out of duty to ourselves. So this is a little odd. Some people have problems wrapping their head around this. He's basically saying that if you have person A and person B, and they both give the same amount of money to charity, but yet person A actually enjoys giving this money to charity, person A gets some sort of emotional kick out of giving money away to charity, but person B hates giving money to charity, yet does it anyway, Kant's going to prefer person B, although we might prefer person A. Oh, they seem nice, they love to give, they get a real kick out of giving money to charity. Person B seems really greedy, they hate it, they don't want to give their money to charity, but they do it out of a sense because they know, well, geez, I don't want to give my money away. I'd love to save it and keep it to myself. But on the other hand, that's just greedy and I shouldn't do that. It's my duty, so I need to perform my duty and help others. This is the kind of moral reasoning that Kant would approve of. The second, not the first. So this is a little odd for some people to really wrap their head around. So towards the middle of the first section, page 12 to 13, we get a few propositions here that Kant thinks follow from this idea of the good will. The idea that the good will is the will that's good without qualification. The first proposition that we gather from this is that an action has to be done from duty to have moral worth, right? That's what a good will is the will that acts according to duty. And if the good will is the highest, the thing that we should esteem in the highest, then duty is very important, not the outcomes, right? So we get to the second proposition that he wants to assert, which follows from this, that any action done from duty has moral worth, not in the purpose or the end attained by it, but on the principle of volition, as he puts it, but on the principle of volition from which the action is performed. So by principle of volition, the reason for my action, what principle am I basing my actions on? What reasons am I giving for my actions in my head? How am I justifying it to myself? From these first two propositions, that all actions have to be done from duty to have moral worth, and the second proposition that actions done from duty have moral worth, not for the purpose or aim, but simply because of the principle they're based on, the third proposition follows, that duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law. Only the law itself, he says, the principle of my action, can be an object of respect and hence a command. Any action, if possessing moral worth, must exclude the influence of my own inclination, and therefore any object or end or aim of my will. So nothing can determine my will if I'm to be a moral agent except one, the law, which he emphasizes as an objective sort of principle, something that's true for everybody, and two, the maxim, that's my subjective principle of volition, the reason that I give to myself to follow such a law. So this is the subjective element. All effects and consequences for Kant do not require a rational being or a will to be brought about. But the highest and unconditioned good does require such a being. The highest and unconditioned good, the good will, does require a moral agent, does require a rational being. Why? Well, what is a good will? It's a will that acts according to duty. Well, don't we need a rational agent to recognize principles, to recognize laws? Yes, we need reason to recognize principles. And so the rational being is required for the good will. There has to be somebody who can recognize what their duty is in order to act according to their duty. The preeminent moral good is the law itself, and this law can only be represented to the understanding of a rational being. This good is good in itself, not merely awaited as a good or an effect. What kind of law can determine the will without reference to any expected effect? Making the will good without qualification. This is the question that Kant turns to at the end of section 1. Now we have to focus on what this law is. What is this principle that the good will has to base its actions on? And this is where he gives us the first formulation of what is known as his categorical imperative. And he repeats this in the second section, but he mentions this first formulation here. And I'm paraphrasing, but what he says is that we should never act in such a way unless we can also will that our maxim should become a universal law. So we should never act in such a way unless we can also will that the maxim of our action, that is the rule expressed in our act, should become a universal law. That is something that is applicable to everyone at all times. So conformity to such a law serves the will as a principle, an explication of our duty. We must conform to it. We must make sure that all of our actions can be universalized. So an example that fails the test, well, what if I make a promise with no intention of keeping it? We can determine what the consequence will be to help us decide, but we're never quite certain what the consequences will be. This is a posteriori. So for him, this is an unreliable method. We won't know until we do it. So I can act according to the maxim, don't promise anything without intending to keep the promise. And this maxim cannot be formulated in response to possible consequences, but it must arise from duty, says Kant. If this maxim, don't promise anything without intending to keep the promise, this is something that can be formulated without any reference to a specific, more a posteriori situation. So to see if my actions accord with duty, we have to ask ourselves, should it be a universal law to lie, or should it be a universal law to tell the truth? The first maxim, to tell a lie, Kant thinks this is self-defeating. The second maxim makes much more sense for him as a universal law. So by self-defeating, he says, if I universalize lying, I wouldn't be able to lie. If everybody lied, then we'd all know that we're all lying, and we wouldn't be able to get away with telling lies. So this is, he says, self-defeating, contradictory. It couldn't work. It couldn't be universalized. Think about if I made it my universal law. Never pay attention to traffic signs. And I say, that's what I live by. I'm going to make it universal. Everybody, everywhere, never pay attention to traffic signs. Would this work as a universal law? Well, perhaps not. There'd probably be quite a few automobile accidents and chaos in the streets. So if the maxim which I act on cannot be made into a universal law, then it must be rejected. It fails the test of the categorical imperative. So it fails the test of Kant's moral law. So to repeat, duty is the necessity of acting from pure respect for the practical law. It's the condition of the will, which is good in itself, the good will. Reason exacts respect for universal legislation, according to Kant. This is where our duty is found. We don't need to understand this principle in its abstract form. We don't need to understand the categorical imperative to understand right and wrong, good and evil. But for Kant, this is the standard of judgment from which these values arise. It's what makes good things good. It's what makes bad things bad. So one can act morally in complete ignorance of the underlying principles, but humans carry within them powerful counterweights to all commands of duty, namely needs and inclinations. So even though we can act moral in complete ignorance of these principles, we don't have to know Kant's categorical imperative. We just have to have sort of an intuitive grasp of it, I suppose. We have counterweights within us that prevent us from acting according to our duty, and he calls them our needs and our inclinations. Both of these are satisfied by happiness. So happiness shouldn't be our moral goal. Another stab at Aristotelian and Thomistic ethics. This causes us to cast doubt upon the strict laws of duty. Our needs and our inclinations make us waver, right? Whenever there's a conflict with our needs and our desires and what duty entails, whenever we fudge, when we bend the rules to fit our needs, such laws of duty are corrupted. Their foundation and dignity is destroyed. And for this reason, ordinary human reason needs to step into the field of practical philosophy, not for the need of speculation, but on purely practical grounds. So what Kant's saying is that we need to step into the realm of philosophy. We need to get straight about what our moral duty is, and this will aid us in our reasonings against the perplexities of these opposing claims, right? Our needs and our inclinations versus what our duty prescribes. And often these conflicts are imperceptible to our ordinary, everyday human understanding. So we have to seek a resolution, he says, in practical philosophy. This leads to section 2. So he talks about the concept of duty some more and mentions how it was drawn from practical reason. Again, practical reason being reason concerning the will and action. And even though it's drawn from our practical reason concerning the will, it's not to be considered a concept of experience. And what he means by that is that in order to have experience, I don't necessarily have to have an understanding of a good will. We don't really have to have an experience of a chair or a table or an object or anything else for that matter. In order to have that experience, I don't need a concept of a good will to understand it. In fact, we meet with transgressions of duty in experience all the time. We meet bad wills all the time. And it may even be complained that we never meet an act, we never see an act or perceive an act that's done purely from duty at all. This might be the egoist's argument. And much is done in accord with duty. There's much that people do that Kant would say is in accordance with their duty, yet there's always room for doubt as to whether what is done is ever done purely from one's duty. And many philosophers have absolutely denied this possibility, and they've reduced all human actions to a more or less refined self-love. You can think of the ethical egoism of Hobbes. He's also a psychological egoist. You can see the definition for these terms up on the web. But even as they've done this, even as the egoists have done this, they failed, according to Kant, they failed to cast doubt upon the rightness of the concept of morality. So though this rightness may never be manifest in a single human act, Kant thinks this does not dispel the fact that it's still right. So when considering moral value, the concern is not actions, which are seen, but rather the inner principles of these actions, which are not seen. And the question is not whether this or that action has ever happened, but rather what action is commanded by reason. What does reason of itself and independently of experience command us? What does reason tell us ought to happen? Consequently, it might command us actions of which the world perhaps has never seen and might be doubted to even be possible if one bases everything off of experience. But unless we wish to deny, according to Kant, unless we wish to deny this concept of morality, all truth in reference to possible objects, if we want to deny to morality this, we can't help but admit that morality applies, 1, to all rational beings, and 2, that it must be valid, not merely under contingent conditions and with some expectation of consequences, but it must be absolutely necessary. And experience, therefore, cannot provide our understanding with the possibility of such necessary laws. That's another strike against Aristotle, because remember, his approach to ethics seems to do this. It looks at individual cases. What is virtuous for this person? Virtuous for that person? Virtuous for this individual? And it tries to draw from them a more general principle. Kant says that's the opposite method that we should use in our approach to ethics. We should look at the principles themselves. And he says it would be the worst service to morality then to derive principles from examples. The idea of moral perfection is what allows us to see the good in moral actions. It's not the other way around. So moral acts allow us to understand moral perfection. Again, anti-Aristotle. Examples serve as encouragement, of course. They make it feasible that what the law commands is possible, but they're not what we derive our idea of the good or what we what we derive our idea of moral perfection from. Morality, according to Kant, must be based on principles that would apply to any rational being, regardless, again, of consequences or context. So to derive moral principles from human experience or from human nature wouldn't work. Hume is one that tries to get morality from human nature. But we're not going to talk too much about Hume. Everything in nature works according to laws. Kant will acknowledge this, but rational beings have the power to act according to the conception of laws, that is, according to principles. The rational being has a will. That is, the rational being has a faculty of choosing only what reason recognizes as being practically necessary. In other words, as good and independent of their inclinations or their desires. So it's possible that the will fails to act in accordance with reason. Sometimes it submits to the subjective conditions, incentives, and things that it looks forward to in the future, instead of the objective conditions. That is what is required by the law. What is objective? These objective principles are represented to the will as commands of reason, or as Kant likes to call them, imperatives. Imperatives are things that are expressed to our will, that are expressed to our faculty of reason by an ought, not necessarily a must, but by an ought. So Kant's looking for a moral imperative. He's got a choice between what he calls hypothetical imperatives or categorical imperatives. Obviously, you should know by now that he chooses categorical imperatives, but what is the distinction? What's the difference? For him, a hypothetical imperative is an imperative, an ought, that is necessary as a means to an end, for some purpose. And under hypothetical, he further distinguishes between two types of these. There's the problematic hypothetical imperative and what he calls the assertoric hypothetical imperative. The problematic hypothetical imperative applies to the realm of science primarily. You might have a scientific problem, and you have to figure out exactly how to answer this problem, how to solve this problem. For instance, let's say you're an astronomer trying to measure the distance between Earth and some star up in the night sky. So if that's the problem, how distant is the star, there's all these hypothetical imperatives that present themselves to your rational mind as an ought. Well, if I need to know the distance from Earth to that star, then I ought to look through the telescope. I ought to measure the frequency of the light, and then I ought to plug it into my equation, whatever the procedure may be. The point is, there's just about as many of these hypothetical imperatives, heck, even more, as there are scientific problems. The assertoric, these are based on an assertion that's not really based on necessity. It's more of a subjective want or need. I assert that I want to win the heart of the girl. I assert that I want to get the promotion. I assert, the child asserts that they want to get the toy, and so they have to behave when they go into public so that the parent will buy them the toy. And so there's just as many of these as there are desires, and they're all uncertain. They're all a posteriori. We never know how effective these will be until we actually enact them. So for him, the hypothetical imperatives will not work. And this is all we get, according to Kant, with this teleological Aristotelian ethics, the ethics of Aristotle. We have an aim, namely happiness, and all these hypothetical imperatives. But he wants his moral law to be a categorical imperative, not necessary as a means to an end, but just objectively necessary in itself. That's what makes it categorical. In all cases, this is the action that reason prescribes. So he calls this apodictic. So it's really just another word for necessary. It's a certain and necessary law, and there's only a few of these. Some Kantians actually read him as saying there's really only one categorical imperative, and all the different versions of it are just simply different formulations. That's just a matter of debate. Some will just argue underlying all of these is this urge for consistency. The first formulation, the second formulation, all the formulations are all aiming towards consistency of moral actions. And so, while hypothetical imperatives are always going to apply to this or that individual, this or that particular individual, the categorical imperative for Kant is going to apply to all rational beings. So what does the categorical imperative look like? Is it something like the golden rule, do unto others as you will have them do unto you, or thou shalt not lie? Is this a categorical imperative? Well, it isn't for Kant. For him, it's too particular. We can think of advantages or disadvantages of lying in certain situations. So for him, we have to investigate the possibility of a categorical imperative a priori, not a posteriori, as thou shalt not lie seems to be. So Kant's already given us one formulation in the first section. The first section, we remember, got the first formulation that the maxim which motivates the action has to be capable of being applied as a universal law. So the reason that I act should be able to be made into a universal law and a reason for anybody, any rational agent, to act at any time. So how does one apply the categorical imperative to a particular situation in order to determine whether or not what one is doing accords with one's duty? How do we do this? How do we actually put the categorical imperative into practice? Well, Kant gives us a few examples, and this is in your textbook around page 31, where we get these 4 examples. The first one I call the suicide. The second one is the dishonest debtor. The third is the talent waster. And then the fourth one is the miser, right? The greedy miser. So let's go ahead and read here on page 31 and see what Kant has to say, and we'll see exactly how this categorical imperative works in a practical sense. So right at the bottom of page 31, Kant mentions the first case. He says, someone feels sick of life because of a series of troubles that has grown to the point of despair, but is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether it would not be contrary to his duty to himself to take his own life. Now he inquires whether the maxim of his action could indeed become a universal law of nature. His maxim, however, is, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than it promises agreeableness. The only further question is whether this principle of self-love could become a universal law. It is then seen at once that a nature whose law it would be to destroy life itself by means of the same feeling whose destination is to impel toward the furtherance of life would contradict itself and would therefore not subsist. Thus, that maxim could not possibly be a law of nature, and accordingly altogether opposes the supreme principle of all duty. Now what Kant is saying here, and this is the important point, and maybe this is where I might take some issue with him, is that what we have here is a contradiction. If we universalize this maxim, then it is self-defeating. But let's look at the maxim, right? That's the first question that we have to ask ourselves if we're trying to apply the first formulation of the categorical imperative. We have to ask ourselves, what is the maxim? That is, what is the principle of volition? What is the reason behind the action? Then we have to see, can it be universal? Could everybody act according to that principle? And if no is the answer to the second question, then we have a violation of our duty. So let's look at the maxim. What is the maxim according to Kant of the suicide? According to Kant, the maxim is right after that colon on the top of page 32. The maxim is, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than it promises agreeableness. And so what he's saying here is that suicide is killing himself out of a love of self. And that if you universalize that, it is absurd, it's self-defeating. That this very same urge to love oneself is the very same urge that seeks to kill or destroy oneself. And so because of this self-defeating and contradictory nature of that maxim, it couldn't stand as a universal law, therefore it's a violation of duty to kill oneself. And here's where I might have issue, and maybe you do as well, that the notion of a suicide killing himself or herself out of self-love, this is what Kant needs. And when I first read this, I thought perhaps the German is wrong. Perhaps selfish is appropriate. But no, he means self-love. He has to mean self-love because that's what makes it absurd. I love myself so much, I have to destroy myself. But let's just go ahead and move on to the next example. We'll reconsider this when we get to the second formulation. I think the second formulation applies much better to the first case. But for Kant, because it involves a contradiction, he's going to call this a perfect duty as opposed to an imperfect duty. And we'll discuss the distinction in just a moment once we get through these first 4 cases. So the second case, and I think this is a much more straightforward case, I think this actually does work, is the one I call the dishonest debtor. So let's read here on page 32. Another finds himself urged by the need to borrow money. He well knows that he will not be able to repay it, but sees also that nothing will be lent him unless he promises firmly to repay it within a determinate time. He would like to make such a promise, but he still has enough conscience to ask himself, is it not forbidden and contrary to duty to help oneself out of need in such a way? Supposing that he still decided to do so, his maxim of action would go as follows. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that this will never happen. Now, this principle of self-love or personal advantage is perhaps quite consistent with my whole future welfare, but the question now is whether it is right. I therefore turn the demand of self-love into a universal law and put the question as follows. How would it be if my maxim became a universal law? I see at once that it could never hold as a universal law and be consistent with itself, but must necessarily contradict itself. For the universality of a law that everyone, when he believes himself to be in need, could promise whatever he pleases with the intention of not keeping it, would make the promise and the end one might have in it itself impossible, since no one would believe what was promised him, but would laugh at all such expressions as vain pretenses. So, if we are the dishonest debtor, and we're asking ourselves, should I or shouldn't I borrow money from this person? I know I'll never be able to pay them back, and if I have to borrow the money from them, I can't tell them that. I have to lie. So is this okay? Well, what's the maxim of the action here? What's the principle that I'm basing my action on? According to Kant, and I think he's right, this is pretty non-controversial, he says that the maxim, back on page 32, is that when I believe myself to be in need of money, I'll borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know this will never happen. Now, could I make this a universal law? What would happen if I made it a universal law? That anyone, anytime they ever needed anything, could make any promise that they wanted without the intentions of making it. According to Kant, it would make this impossible. If I made lying universal, I couldn't get away with lying. Everybody would know I was lying. So if I went to somebody and I told them, I'm really in need, I'm short on money, I need money for rent, could you let me borrow $1,000? I swear I'll pay you back. They would just laugh at me, according to Kant. They would laugh at such promises, such utterances as vain pretenses, to use his word. So for Kant, this is a violation of duty. To borrow money, to make promises without any intention of keeping those promises is surely a violation of duty. And because it's a complete contradiction, again, this is a perfect duty. And we'll get to the perfect and imperfect duties in a moment. But let's go on to the third case, the one that I call the talent waster. So continuing on page 32, a third finds in himself a talent that by the means of some cultivation could make him a human being useful for all sorts of purposes. However, he finds himself in comfortable circumstances and prefers to give himself up to pleasure than to trouble himself with enlarging and improving his fortunate natural predispositions. But he still asks himself whether his maxim of neglecting his natural gifts, besides being consistent with his propensity to amusement, is also consistent with what one calls duty. He now sees that a nature could indeed subsist with such a universal law, although the human being should let his talents rust and be concerned with devoting his life merely to idleness, amusement, procreation, in a word, to enjoyment. Only he cannot possibly will that this become a universal law, or be put in us as such by means of natural instinct. For as a rational being, he necessarily wills that all the capacities in him be developed, since they serve him and are given to him for all sorts of possible purposes. So the talent waster, this guy is a genius, let's say. He has all sorts of talents. Perhaps if he applied himself, he could find a cure for cancer, solve world hunger, etc., etc. But yet he inherits a lot of money. He inherits a small fortune and decides to just lay around the house all day on the couch watching reality TV. So Kant wants to say, can this be universalized? Would this work as a universal law? He says, well, it perhaps could. Perhaps if everybody acted this way and was just lazy, they might be able to subsist. But what's the problem? It's not a contradiction in principle, so it's not a perfect duty that's being violated. But Kant uses the term, it's not possible to will that this is a universal law. It is possible to apply it, but not possible to will it. So the guy could get away with it, but he couldn't will it consistently. Let's move on to the fourth case, and I'll come back to the third when we're going over the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. So this is the fourth and final case. There's a fourth for whom things are going well, while he sees that others, whom he could very well help, have to contend with great hardships. He thinks, what is it to me? Let each be as happy as heaven wills, or as he can make himself. I shall take nothing from him, nor even envy him, only I do not care to contribute anything to his welfare or to his assistance in need. Now, if such a way of thinking were to become a universal law, the human race could admittedly very well subsist. No doubt even better than when everyone prates about sympathy and benevolence, and even exerts himself to practice them occasionally. But on the other hand also cheats where he can, sells the rights of human beings, or otherwise infringes upon it. But although it's possible that a universal law could subsist in accordance with such a maxim, it is still impossible to will that such a principle hold everywhere as a law of nature. For a will that decided this would conflict with itself, since many cases could occur in which one would need the love and sympathy of others, and in which, by such a law of nature, arisen from his own will, he would rob himself of all hope of the assistance he wishes for himself. So the miser, the greedy miser, this is what I call the fourth case. The guy who has all the money, who has all the success, and looks around him and sees those who are in need, who he could certainly help. He says that he's not going to do this. Why help anybody? I'll let them be as miserable or as happy as they can make themselves. I'm not going to get in the way, but I'm not going to assist them. So this is his principle. Never help anybody, and perhaps to be consistent, if he universalizes it, never take help from anybody, never receive help from anybody, never help anybody in need, never take assistance when in need. If he universalized this, Kant says, this could work. The society could subsist on such a principle. And it might even work even better, he says. That sounds kind of weird. Kant seems to be very suspicious of sympathy. And you might think that this is weird, but it's kind of in keeping with his own philosophy. Remember, if you do something out of sympathy, you're doing it out of pity for somebody else. So you're not doing it because of your duty, but because of your own needs and inclinations or your own desires. So perhaps if we didn't pity people, this wouldn't be the end of the world, and it certainly isn't self-defeating. Doesn't involve a contradiction, but we couldn't consistently will it. So it's not a perfect duty, it's an imperfect duty. It's not a perfect duty, it's not something whose violation involves contradiction, but it's an imperfect duty. The violation involves a contradiction in the will, not in principle. So what does that mean? Let's go ahead and go back to the talent waster, and let's try to kill kind of two birds with one stone. Perfect duty versus imperfect duty. So the guy who's a talent waster, he could be lazy as a universal principle. It's not self-defeating. The guy who's the miser, who doesn't want to give charity, he can make that a universal principle. It's not contradictory. It's not a straight contradiction. But neither one of them could consistently will this. So what does that mean? Well, think about the talent waster laying around the house, doesn't want to develop any of his natural aptitude, doesn't want to develop any of his natural talent. And so he's flipping channels, and he comes across a documentary on the History Channel, starts to learn a little bit. Immediately he goes, oh no, I'm starting to learn something. I better go back to Jersey Shore, and flips the channel back to the Jersey Shore. Of course, this is an absurd behavior. There's no way to avoid developing your talents in some sense or another. You couldn't consistently will it, as Kant puts it. Maybe you'd just get really good at flipping channels, or you'd develop a talent of avoiding developing your talents. The point is that eventually your will would conflict. You'd have needs and desires that would conflict with this. So it is not a contradiction in principle, but it couldn't be consistently willed. The uncharitable miser, the guy who doesn't want to give his money away, again, it could work as a universal principle, not self-defeating, but one couldn't consistently will this, because there might be times when you need help. And that seems very un-Kantian. That seems very a posteriori. What is he saying here? He's saying, well, you should help others because in the future you may need help. That's very a posteriori. We're waiting for something to happen. I want to know that it's good just because it's good. But think about it this way. If I make this my universal principle, never help anybody, never accept help from people in need, I couldn't will this consistently. Eventually, I'd be in the quicksand and sinking to the bottom of the quicksand, and then somebody would walk by and I'd be holding my hand out, please help me, please help me. Then I'd have to think, wait a minute, no, my universal principle is never to help anybody and never to accept help. So don't help me, leave me and let me die. Again, absurd behavior. There is no way we could consistently will that. Eventually, we'd be in a situation like that. So the difference between a perfect and an imperfect duty. The first two cases involve perfect duties, right? The suicide, it's a perfect duty to ourselves not to commit suicide. And in the second case, the dishonest debtor, it's a perfect duty that we have to others not to lie. These are perfect duties because they both duties, if they're broken, they lead to contradiction. But the perfect duty involves a contradiction of principle, whereas an imperfect duty, it involves a contradiction of the will or a contradiction of our needs. And so how can we couch this in terms of the rational agent? See, Kant makes such a big deal about reason. Reason is necessary to recognize the moral law. The rational being is really the only thing for him that is intrinsically valuable. Rational beings are excluded from what he calls the kingdom of ends. So although rational beings are a part of nature, they're not considered as means, but as ends. We have to extract all empirical elements, and therefore any contingent purposes for which there are means to. And what's left is just the rational being. If we take all the empirical evidence, the contingent and contextual, not evidence, but if we take all the information regarding each individual, what's left is rationality. And for him, the rational being is the end in itself. It has intrinsic moral worth. We speak of things versus persons. The rational being is not a thing, it's a person that has absolute worth, and for him is the sole ground for the categorical imperative. Must have a rational agent in order to recognize the categorical imperative. And so this brings us to Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, where he couches it in terms of the rational beings. How should we treat other rational beings? What should we concern ourselves with in our actions towards, or the actions that involve other rational beings? Well, according to Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, we should always act in a way such that we treat humanity, whether in our own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. In other words, we can't use people towards our own ends. We can't use somebody because we think we can sort of get an advantage out of this person. We have to respect them as an end in themselves. And so when we go back to the four cases, how does one apply this formulation? I believe it's a little easier to do this with the second formulation than it is with the first. With the first formulation, we have to ask, well, what's the maxim? And then we also have to ask, can it be universalized? Well, with the second formulation, we just ask ourselves, is anybody in this situation being used as a means to an end? If the answer is yes, then we surely have a violation of our duty. So obviously, in the suicide case, who's being used as a means to an end? Remember, Kant says that not only do we not use others as a means to an end, but we can't use ourselves as a means to an end. So for him, the suicide is using themselves as a means towards an end. I have this end of alleviating pain. I'm going to use myself to destroy myself to achieve that end. The second case is probably the most straightforward. Obviously, the dishonest debtor, the guy who's borrowing money, is using the other person as a means towards an end, not respecting them as a rational being, worthy of moral consideration, but rather as somebody who doesn't really deserve any moral consideration, but I can lie to them and say anything I want in order to get the desired end that I want to achieve. The talent waster, he's, again, like the suicide, using himself as a means to an end. And really, Kant doesn't point this out, but I suppose potentially he's using others as means to an end, or he's not respecting them as ends in themselves. If he's capable, perhaps, of benefiting society with his talents, he's certainly not considering his fellow humans as ends in themselves. And the dishonest debtor is making the same mistake, not really considering the other people out there in need as ends in themselves, but rather maybe just as obstacles. They're not anything worthy of moral consideration. They're just an obstacle on his way to financial happiness, or greedy happiness, miserly happiness, you might put it. So some objections to Kantian ethics is that it's just very impracticable. You can't really put it into practice. It's just too rigid. And we involve ourselves in some absurd moral situations when we tell ourselves that we can never use anybody as a means to an end. We can never lie to anybody. One of the most famous examples that's brought up a lot is the famous Nazi example, right? What if you're somebody who's living in Berlin in 1933 and you have a bunch of Jewish friends? Right, when Hitler is really taking over, getting all of his power consolidated, and you're sitting at home listening to the radio, and one of your Jewish friends knocks on the door. You hear a knock at the door. You open the door up, and, well, there's your buddy. He says, "Please, can I hide in your back room? I'm being followed by the SS, by the Gestapo. They're going to come and kill me." Well, of course, he's your friend. You don't want him to die, and you want to protect him. You have a duty to others to protect them when they're in need. So certainly, of course, you can come and hide. Well, now you sit back down and listen to your radio program, and a few minutes later, there's another knock at the door. You open the door, and lo and behold, there are some Nazis outside, and they say, "Wo ist die Juden?" or "Where are the Jews?" And you say, "What Jews? This is not Kantian. Can you lie to the Germans, to the Nazis? You're not supposed to use them as a means to an end. To be the Kantian, you have to say, well, there is a Jew in the back. He's hiding back there. I can't tell a lie." Is this practicable? Is this the right thing to do morally? Some will just laugh at this. Some Kantians in defense will try to say that, for all I know, my friend is not back there anymore. So you could perhaps tell the Nazis that you don't know if there are any Jews in your apartment. You're not sure. For all you know, your friend could have jumped out the window or crawled out the window when he heard the knock at the door. But really, is this going to work? What are the Nazis going to do if you say that? Well, we will find out, right? They're going to charge in and try to find your friend, and that's not going to help. So, imagine you're on the International Space Station, and a group of very lazy aliens fly by, and they say, we're very advanced, but we're kind of lazy. What we're doing is we're going around the universe, and we're exterminating any planet, any life on any planet where the population exceeds 2 million. So they ask you, are there more than 2 million people of Earth? We're on a very tight schedule. We don't want to do the research ourselves. So really, could you just tell us, are there more than 2 million people on Earth? If there's no more than 2 million, if there's less than 2 million, we'll just go on our way and we'll go ahead and go to the next planet. But if there are more than 2 million, we're going to destroy all life on Earth. Do you tell the aliens the truth? Kant might say, if they're a rational being, then you should tell them the truth. They deserve respect, and you can't use them as a means to an end. But I'm telling you that I would lie, and perhaps I would not be a good Kantian in this situation. So just a quick recap of our whole lecture here on Kant, and then I'll get to one more objection to Kant. He starts with the notion of a goodwill. Remember, this is sort of the foundation for his ethics. It's the one thing that's good in and of itself, unlike happiness, which we really condemn in those who don't deserve. Those who don't deserve happiness, we condemn them. The notion of a goodwill, he says, leads to this concept of duty, because one's duty is what explains a goodwill. The goodwill acts according to this versus one's inclinations or one's desires. And our duty is expressed as an ought, as a pure moral motive, what one ought to do. Has to be based on a principle, and this principle has to be impartial, that is, without any sort of selfish intentions. It has to have consistency, and we get consistency in the formulations of the categorical imperative. They're not just universal, but they're able to be willed consistently. Of course, in order to recognize these principles, we need reason. So we have to have rationality. Rationality is necessary for the moral principles, and for Kant, a rational being is the only thing that is intrinsically valuable. Okay, it's the only intrinsically valuable thing, which brings us to the final objection. Perhaps Kant is overlooking some things or entities or objects besides rational beings that should be included in our moral community. If there's a community of moral beings that deserve moral consideration, perhaps we should expand the categories for moral consideration beyond the category of rational beings. Aren't there other things, perhaps animals, that deserve moral consideration? There's a lot of people who are animal rights activists, and there's certainly laws against cruelty to animals, so these seem to be moral concerns. In one of Kant's later writings, he addresses the problem of cruelty to animals, but it's not a very Kantian response as far as I'm concerned. He says that we shouldn't be cruel to animals because this might transfer to cruelty to humans. And perhaps he's correct. I think this happened to Jeffrey Dahmer as a child. He supposedly was torturing little stray animals, and of course we know what became of Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. So perhaps Kant is right, but why is this not a very Kantian reply to the issue of cruelty to animals or animal rights? Well, what is he saying? He's saying you shouldn't be cruel to animals because in the future it might develop into cruelty to humans. This is very a posteriori. It's not based on necessity, as Kant would say. And another group who seems excluded from Kant's moral community are babies. Are they able to recognize the categorical imperative? Remember, a rational being for Kant is a being capable of understanding the moral law. Well, if babies can't understand the moral law, what makes them worthy of moral consideration? What makes mentally disabled people worthy of moral consideration? If they're mentally disabled to the point where they can't understand that categorical imperative, if they're in a coma, for instance, euthanasia is a contemporary debate, whether euthanasia is ever appropriate. And somebody in a coma who suffered great damage to their brain, who might just be a vegetable, for Kant, this is not a part of the moral community. So aren't there other things that are intrinsically valuable besides rational beings? Maybe even the environment. You might talk about environmentalist ethics, and certainly this is a hot topic in contemporary moral debates. How much moral responsibility do we have to the environment? And Kant doesn't seem to have a place for the environment in his moral community if the environment can't recognize the moral law or the moral principle of the categorical imperative. So those are just some flaws with Kant's ethics, but in the next reading, when we get to Thomas Nagel, we'll see some other problems that he points out, that he considers problems with the Kantian ethical scheme, particularly Kant's claims that all moral judgments can be a priori or should be a priori in nature. So that's what we'll turn to next.